Nobody in Redwood City, California, expected Chris Hemsworth's response that overcast afternoon. The sky seemed to hang low, its gray hue reflecting a quiet tension that nobody could quite place. While Redwood City was usually vibrant with weekend crowds bustling around the casual cafes and neighborhood shops, on this particular day, a palpable heaviness lingered in the humid air. School children had just been let out, their chatter mingling with the subdued rumble of traffic along the main roads. Street vendors sold hot dogs and tacos from their carts, steam rising into the cloud-laden sky. It was a normal scene by most standards. People on their way to errands, employees commuting home, and local teenagers congregating around bus stops. But within a matter of moments, everything changed. Chris Hemsworth, in town under the radar for a brief vacation, found himself strolling through Redwood City's eclectic downtown. No paparazzi trailed him, for he was traveling incognito, sporting an old baseball cap and simple jeans, trying to blend in. Though Redwood City's residents were used to occasional celebrity sightings. San Francisco was close enough that famous faces sometimes popped in. Chris rarely attracted attention in these quieter corners, especially midweek. He'd slipped into a coffee shop earlier, charmed the barista with his unassuming manner, and then headed out to experience the city's laid-back vibe. It was around 3:00 p.m., and the local bus stop across from the coffee shop was thick with people waiting for their next ride. Behind them, small shops displayed open signs, while light, intermittent drizzle darkened the sidewalks. A restless queue formed along the curb, older folks with grocery bags, college students leafing through textbooks, and several 9-to-5ers checking their watches anxiously. The hiss of traffic occasionally drowned out murmured conversation. Clouds overhead signaled a heavier rainstorm threatening to break loose at any moment. Chris was only passing by when he noticed a particular tension near the front of the line. A woman in her late 20s, petite, curly-haired, wearing large sunglasses, stood beside a black Labrador whose harness indicated it was a guide dog. The dog's calm demeanor and watchful stance were clear signals to anyone familiar with service animals. Yet, an older bus driver, uniform cap askew, blocked the woman's path onto the bus. The driver's face was set in a deep scowl, and he gestured angrily toward the dog, his voice raised. "I can't let you ride with that thing." Chris heard the driver snap. "I have rules to follow, lady. You'll have to wait for another bus or get a cab." And the crowd around them fell silent. They seemed unsure whether to speak up. Some looked away, unwilling to engage in conflict, while others leaned in, expressions a mix of shock and confusion. The woman, her head slightly tilted as though trying to focus on the driver's voice, held her ground. She seemed poised yet visibly distressed, clutching the dog's harness. Still, she spoke softly, as if attempting not to escalate the situation. "With all due respect, sir," she began. "This is my guide dog. Under the law, I'm allowed to ride public transit with him. If you're worried about something, we can talk, but please don't turn me away." Chris Hemsworth, drawn by the scene and the injustice inherent in it, halted mid-step. A part of him debated whether he should intervene. After all, sometimes stepping into these situations could complicate them. But one look at the woman's troubled face was all it took. There was a resolve in her eyes that reminded Chris of the countless times he'd portrayed heroes on screen, men who never backed down from doing what was right. This, however, was no movie set. This was real life, and that sense of reality spurred him to take out his phone, discreetly starting to record what was unfolding. The bus driver's rebuff continued, his voice rising with each passing second. He rattled off excuses about company policy and no animals allowed, ignoring the clear fact that service animals were, in fact, permitted by law. The woman, named Ava. Chris overheard her say so when someone asked if she needed help. Began trembling slightly. She clutched the dog's harness more tightly, and the Labrador pressed reassuringly against her, as though sensing the tension. Several bystanders began muttering. One man, wearing a baseball cap that rivaled Chris's for anonymity, muttered that it was just plain wrong. Another woman, middle-aged and carrying a shopping bag of produce, openly asked the driver if he understood the law. Still, no one made a decisive move. The driver's flustered aggression seemed to hold them at bay. He was, after all, an authority figure in that small slice of Redwood City life, the one who decided who got to ride and who didn't. Most people simply wanted to get home, they didn't want trouble. Chris Hemsworth felt a surge of indignation. He moved closer. A bit of drizzle slicked his phone screen, and he quickly wiped it against his jeans, making sure the camera was still capturing everything. He took a deep breath, stepped up behind Ava and said in a calm, firm voice, "Excuse me, sir, but I believe federal regulations allow service animals on public transport. There's no reason for you to deny her entry." The driver spun around. For a split second, confusion flashed across his face. He did a quick double take, perhaps noticing the faint familiarity of Chris's features beneath the cap. But he seemed too caught up in his own frustration to fully register who he was talking to. "Mind your business," the driver snapped. "I decide who rides my bus." Those words hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. The drizzle became a more steady rain, as if nature itself was reflecting the dark turn this altercation had taken. People shuffled, uncertain if they should protest or not. Ava's cheeks reddened. She angled her face toward the direction of Chris's voice, a hint of relief washing over her tense expression. "Sir," she said again, trying once more for civility, "I only need to get home. I'm visually impaired and my guide dog is trained. I have every right to use this service." Despite her calm tone, the bus driver jabbed a thumb over his shoulder. "Not on my watch," he growled. Then he shut the door with a hiss, stepping back into the driver's seat to presumably drive off. Several passengers inside the bus looked on with concern, some shaking their heads, others too afraid to speak up. That might have been the end of it. Just another instance of injustice overlooked. Had Chris not stood firmly in front of the bus doors, he lifted one hand toward the driver, motioning for him to stop. "Wait," Chris said, louder now. "You can't just do that." He pivoted to address the small crowd. The phone still in his other hand, camera rolling. "She's being denied her rights. We all see it, right? And I'm filming this because it's not okay?" A hush fell once more. People looked at each other, some nodding in agreement. A wave of empowerment seemed to ripple through the bystanders. One older man, silver-haired and leaning on a cane, stepped forward and declared, "She's allowed on the bus. Guide dogs are allowed." Others chimed in, voices strong and resolute. The driver, confronted by so many, gave a harsh snort and opened the bus door again. "Fine, fine. Get on. Just don't cause trouble," he mumbled. But there was no apology, no recognition of wrongdoing. Ava hesitated, uncertain whether to trust the sudden change in attitude. The dog, sensing Ava's hesitation, sniffed at the bus steps. Chris gently touched Ava's shoulder, voice warm. "It's okay," he murmured. "You have a right to this. I've got it on video, and I'm not going anywhere until I see you safely aboard." As Ava boarded, the driver sputtered under his breath. Chris made sure his camera captured it. Something about the entire exchange felt deeply unsettling. That the driver would so easily dismiss a passenger's rights and blame company policy hinted at a bigger problem. This wasn't just one man's prejudice. It felt systemic, an echo of an outdated approach to people with disabilities. Right then, Chris had no idea how far this incident would go. He only knew it felt wrong, and that if he didn't speak up, he'd regret it forever. The bus rumbled off into the traffic, carrying Ava away. The tension among the bystanders lingered. Eventually, they dispersed, each heading to their errands, the day's normal rhythm creeping back. Yet a subtle current of unrest buzzed beneath the surface. Chris lowered his phone, paused to check the footage, and felt a swirl of determination and anger. He realized he had a responsibility to do something with this evidence. Silence would only enable the injustice to continue. He turned, exhaling a shaky breath as he walked back toward the coffee shop's awning to get out of the rain. In his mind, a flurry of questions sprang up. Should he share the footage publicly? Should he contact the local transit authorities first? Who was that driver really, and was this an isolated event or part of a broader practice? He gazed through the rain at Redwood City's downtown streets. They seemed calm, unsuspecting. The next step was unclear, but one thing was certain. Redwood City was about to witness a reckoning, one that Chris Hemsworth, unwittingly at first, had set into motion. In the ensuing days, as the rain clouds gave way to sunshine, Redwood City's small moments of daily life continued as usual, but behind the scenes, a massive shift was about to happen. Chris, once only an observer, now found himself at the center of a storm brewing around accessibility, human rights, and the misuse of authority. He had filmed something would crack open the door to deeper revelations about the transit system and those who ran it. And though he never planned to be a crusader in Redwood City, the truth he captured with his phone would change everything for Ava, for the city's disabled community, and for himself. That moment at the bus stop became the catalyst for a chain of events far grander and more tumultuous than anyone could have anticipated. Within an hour after Chris Hemsworth left the bus stop, he reached out to a local advocacy group for people with disabilities, an organization called Redwood Allies for Accessibility. He emailed them a copy of the footage, explaining what he had witnessed, uncertain of how to proceed. He also included his contact information, though he signed off simply as Chris, trying not to leverage his celebrity status. The group's response came swiftly, a grateful and urgent request to speak with him in person. The next day, Chris found himself sitting in a modest conference room within RAA's small downtown office. The organization's director, Patricia, was a middle-aged woman with a warm but determined demeanor. She had an air about her that suggested years of battling bureaucracy for the sake of the people she served. Beside her sat Mikhail, the group's legal advisor, a quiet man who listened intently, his intense brown eyes rarely blinking. They showed the video on a large screen, analyzing every second the bus driver's aggressive gestures, the moment he shut the door, the final reluctant acceptance under group pressure. Thank you for bringing this to us, Patricia said, turning to face Chris. Your footage is a powerful piece of evidence, not just for the treatment of that passenger, Ava, but also because it highlights a repeated issue. This driver, we've had a few complaints about him before, but the proof was never so clear. But Chris felt a spark of realization. So he's done this before. Allegedly, Mikhail clarified. We've received at least 3 complaints in the last year from visually impaired passengers and even one from a veteran with a service dog for PTSD. Each time, the complaints went to Redwood City Transit. We never saw much traction in the official follow-ups. There was always some excuse, lack of evidence, or a misunderstanding, or claims the dog was being disruptive. It's always something. Patricia pulled out a file that looked 2 inches thick. We suspect it's bigger than just one individual. We think Redwood City Transit has a pattern of turning a blind eye to certain employees who discriminate against people with disabilities. Could be ignorance of the law, or maybe it's personal prejudice, or maybe it's something else. We don't know, but your video is the best evidence we've had in ages. At the heart of Chris's chest, he felt a gentle but insistent tug, like an invisible chain pulling him deeper into a cause he never knew existed. He might have just posted the video online, hoping public pressure would do its job. But to see the thick folder of complaints, and to hear the stories from Patricia and Mikhail reminded him that this wasn't just about exposing a single bus driver. It was about confronting a system that repeatedly failed its most vulnerable passengers. He spoke softly, almost hesitant. What can I do to help? I'm not an expert in activism, but this is important. But Patricia and Mikhail exchanged a look. We'd like to organize a meeting with Redwood City Transit leadership. Patricia began. We've been pushing for changes in policy, mandatory disability rights training, better enforcement. So far, we've been met with a lot of polite acknowledgments but no real action. Your presence might. Well, it might encourage them to finally listen. Chris frowned. He disliked the idea of using his celebrity as leverage. But if it could champion a good cause, so be it. All right. If it helps, I'll show up in person. And if Redwood City Transit refuses to address the issue, we can release the video to local media. Maybe even national outlets. People need to know. Mikhail smiled for the first time. That kind of exposure can be powerful. But it could also backfire. Redwood City Transit might circle the wagons, claim you're smearing them, or maybe even discredit your footage. They might spin it, call it an isolated incident, say the driver had personal problems. There's a million ways they can deflect responsibility. Chris leaned forward, clasping his hands. Then we gather more evidence. We talk to more victims. We bring them forward if they're willing. And we show Redwood City Transit that we won't back down. If they're worried about a PR fiasco, we'll make it clear that the only way to avoid that is by actually fixing the problem. Patricia nodded, a light of admiration in her eyes. We'll organize that. Thank you, Chris. And if you ever need any guidance, just let us know. I know you're putting yourself out there in a big way. Chris exhaled, half laughing. I've been in big fights before, but usually on a film set. Doing it for real is another matter. By the following week, Redwood City had become abuzz with rumors of that bus incident. Word spread fast. Someone who was at the bus stop recognized Chris Hemsworth from the coffee shop earlier and told a friend, who told a local blogger, who posted about it on social media. The short clip Chris had taken hadn't yet been shared publicly, but the talk alone ignited a flurry of speculation. Redwood City Transit was aware of it too. Patricia had already reached out to the transit director's office. They responded with a polite, guarded invitation to meet and discuss the matter in a productive way, though they requested that the video remain private until the meeting concluded. The day of the meeting arrived under a sky still overcast, but threatening to break into sunlight at any moment. Chris Hemsworth headed to Redwood City, Transit's main office building. It was a squat, nondescript structure of beige concrete and tinted windows, tucked near the industrial edge of downtown. Outside, a few buses waited in a parked row, their engines off, as if dozing in the late morning hush. Patricia and Mikhail had gone on ahead. Chris stepped inside the lobby and immediately felt the sterile chill of air conditioning. A reception desk with a large Redwood City Transit logo greeted him. The receptionist recognized him instantly, eyes going wide, but maintained professional composure. They're waiting for you in conference room B, she said. He followed the hallway and stepped into a broad room around a massive oval table. Seated on one side were Patricia and Mikhail, along with two other ARA members, a softly spoken but resolute older man named Gary, a retired teacher who used a wheelchair, and a young woman named Daria, who had partial hearing loss. Opposite them were three stern-faced figures: Randolph King, Redwood City Transit's director, an older man with silver hair meticulously parted; Celia Anders, the head of their legal department, with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, and the bus driver from the video. His name, apparently, was Elroy Francis. Immediately, Chris noticed the discomfort on Elroy's face. He barely made eye contact. Patricia gestured for Chris to take the seat beside her. As soon as he did, Randolph King cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," Randolph said, voice laced with politeness yet heavy with undertones of impatience. "We want to address the situation from last week. Mr. Francis claims there was a misunderstanding. fueled by stress and schedule constraints. Redwood City Transit values inclusivity and the rights of every passenger. We regret if Ms. Ava. He paused, glancing at the notes in front of him. Felt inconvenienced or mistreated. Patricia's posture was upright, her expression resolute. Your regret is noted. However, RAA has documentation of multiple similar incidents involving Mr. Francis as well as other drivers. It isn't an isolated case. We also have footage. At that Celia Anders cut in smoothly. We understand a bystander recorded the event. We'd like to see the video so we can assess the context. Our stance is that Redwood City Transit upholds the law, but sometimes there are logistical issues to consider. Many drivers encounter dogs claimed as service animals that are actually not trained at all, posing a risk to other passengers. We must ensure safety. Chris felt his hand tighten into a fist under the table. He was about to speak when Mikhail gently placed a hand on his arm, a subtle signal to let Patricia finish. Patricia responded, We do not dispute that some people try to pass off pets as service animals. But Ava had a legitimate guide dog, with visible identification. She tried multiple times to explain, and Mr. Francis refused. This is unacceptable. Across the table, Mr. Francis shifted in his chair, swallowing hard. It was a busy day, he muttered. She arrived during rush hour. I was behind schedule. It's not like I left her stranded. I eventually let her on. He said it as though that absolved him of any wrongdoing. Chris exchanged a look with Patricia, silently asking for permission to interject. She gave him a slight nod and he spoke up. I was there, he said calmly. I filmed it. She didn't just arrive out of nowhere. She was in line well before the bus arrived. She was patient, and your immediate reaction was to deny her. The only reason you let her on was that multiple bystanders confronted you. Miss Sir. Francis pressed his lips together but said nothing. Randolph cleared his throat again, eager to move on. I'm sure we can come to a more constructive resolution than pointing fingers. Redwood City Transit is prepared to issue a formal apology to Ms. Ava. Assuming this was a singular incident, and we will undertake a review of our policies. We'd like to keep this matter out of the media if possible. After all, negative publicity helps no one. Patricia took a breath. We're not here for an apology alone. We want policy change. We have a whole folder. She tapped it. Of complaints from passengers with disabilities who were dismissed, humiliated, or even barred from riding because of misinformation or prejudice on the part of your staff. We're asking for mandatory training for all drivers, especially focusing on how to identify and properly accommodate legitimate service animals. We also want a clear disciplinary policy for employees who violate these rights. Mikhail added, and while you review your policies, you might consider adopting a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination of any kind. A first offense like this, especially with proof, should result in serious consequences. Randolph's eyebrows rose, and Celia Anders scrawled something on a legal pad. That's quite a tall order, Celia said. We have union regulations for our drivers. We can't simply adopt harsh punishments without negotiation. It might lead to strikes or disputes. It's complicated. Gary, who had remained mostly silent, leaned forward in his wheelchair. His voice was gentle yet firm. We understand complications. But from our perspective, it's a matter of human rights. If Redwood City Transit can't guarantee that drivers won't be allowed to discriminate against passengers with disabilities, then Redwood City Transit is failing in its fundamental mission of serving the public. A brief silence settled in the room. Chris noticed how Elroy slouched in his seat, jaw tight. For a moment, Chris wondered if there was something else behind Elroy's hostility. Fear, perhaps, or an unresolved personal resentment. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it made Chris realize that unveiling the truth might be messy and layered. People's motivations were seldom simple. Finally, Randolph forced a smile. We hear you. We're committed to exploring these proposals. but I do want to address your threat of releasing the video. If Redwood City Transit is seen in a negative light, we all lose. Ridership could decline, funding could be impacted, and ironically, there might be less money available for training. Let's be rational here. There's a process. Patricia raised her hand, halting him. Yes, there is a process, and it's taken too long for Redwood City Transit to do something. This is not the first time we've come to you. The difference now is we have solid, irrefutable proof of what's happening. Our goal isn't to destroy Redwood City Transit. It's to reform it. Chris chimed in. If you truly value an inclusive community, you'll implement real changes, not just talk about them. If that doesn't happen, yes, we will release the video. That final statement brought the meeting to a sudden hush. Aroy's knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair. Randolph's forced composure wavered, a slight grimace betraying his frustration, while Celia pursed her lips in measured disapproval. Patricia, seeing the tension, wrapped up. We'll give you 2 weeks to present us with a concrete plan. Otherwise, we'll have to take other measures. Randolph nodded stiffly. Understood. We'll be in touch. And with that, the meeting ended, lacking any courtesy beyond a few terse goodbyes. Walking out of Redwood City Transit's headquarters, Chris and the RAA group paused in the parking lot. The industrial smell of rubber and asphalt filled the humid air. Boozes in the adjacent depot silently awaited their next routes. You think they'll actually do something? Chris asked, glancing at Patricia. She shrugged, expression lined with cautious hope. If they're smart, yes. If not, we'll make noise. It's as simple as that. Gary gave Chris's shoulder a friendly pat. Thanks for stepping in. A lot of people in your position might have just posted the video online and left it at that. The fact you're here means a lot to us. Chris mustered a small smile. I just did what anyone should do. Ava deserves to ride the bus without harassment. And she's not the only one. Daria, who'd been quiet, raised her phone where she'd typed a message at Tia Kainwo-oo. She signed the words for emphasis. Chris nodded, touched by the sincerity in her gesture. Together, they all dispersed toward their cars, each carrying the weight of the day's meeting and the uncertainty that lay ahead. On his drive back, Chris contemplated his involvement. Redwood City, once just a quiet place for him to retreat and grab coffee unbothered, had now become a battleground for disability rights. The city's breezy streets and unassuming sidewalks looked different to him, as though a subtle shift in perspective had removed a veneer of normalcy and exposed underlying fractures. He found himself deeply invested, an unexpected champion in a fight that wasn't originally his. Yet he felt no regret. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sure enough, Redwood City Transit responded a week later, but not with the definitive plan Rye had hoped for. Instead, they sent a carefully worded email. We are looking into this matter. We value our disabled passengers and take these allegations seriously. We will conduct an internal review. We appreciate your patience. To Patricia, it sounded like the same bureaucratic dance Redwood City Transit had been doing for years. She called Chris immediately. It's the same old runaround, she said. They're stalling, hoping we'll give up. Chris had known the meeting might not be a silver bullet, but hearing the frustration in Patricia's voice made him consider the next step more seriously. Then we follow through, he said. We go public. Patricia hesitated. We should try to find more victims who are willing to speak on record. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Not just a viral video, but a thorough expose on Redwood City Transit's pattern of discrimination. Chris exhaled. Agreed. Let's do it. But what followed was a week of frantic activity. RA put out calls on social media and through their networks, inviting anyone with a similar story to come forward. They organized small group discussions at their office, inviting individuals who had faced harassment denial of service, or any other discrimination while riding Redwood City's buses. One by one, the stories poured in. There was Marco, a veteran who relied on his service dog to navigate anxiety triggers from PTSD. He recounted how 3 times a driver told him to move to the back of the bus with his dog, away from the normal passengers. He had lodged complaints, but never heard back. There was Danielle, a single mother whose teenage son used a wheelchair. She described how her son was refused boarding after the driver insisted the bus couldn't accommodate a wheelchair that size, despite official guidelines stating otherwise. An older man, Horace, spoke about being verbally harassed by the same driver, Aroy, after the driver grew impatient with his slow boarding. He said I was holding everyone up, told me I should schedule rides for old folks instead of using the public bus. It was heartbreaking, each testimony weaving a stark tapestry of systemic neglect. Chris attended many of these group discussions. Often, he recorded testimonies on video, this time openly, with each person's permission. They had different stories but the same through line: Redwood City Transit's pattern of ignoring complaints or dismissing them as misunderstandings. As Chris listened, his anger at the injustice grew. But so did his admiration for these individuals. None of them saw themselves as victims. They were people living their lives, trying to get by in a system that too often placed obstacles in their path. Chris recognized that a single bus driver's bias was only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper problem was Redwood City Transit's complacency. All the while, Ava, the woman from the original incident, remained a central figure. She hesitantly agreed to share her story on camera. Her voice trembled at times, but she spoke with measured resolve about how she had felt that day. Humiliated, powerless, and singled out for something that wasn't her fault. She explained how important it was for people with visual impairments to have reliable public transport. Her guide dog, Riley, sat quietly by her side, tail gently wagging as though offering moral support. She concluded her statement with a resolute stand. "We just want to live our lives with dignity and respect. Like everyone else, no more, no less." Doc. Finally, the time came to go public. RA compiled the video testimonies, the original bus stop footage, and commentary from legal experts explaining the relevant disability rights laws. Chris worked with a friend in media who arranged for coverage in a prominent local news segment. They planned a press conference in front of Redwood City's historic courthouse, a stately building with tall pillars and a wide stone staircase. The day of the event arrived bright and crisp, the sun breaking through the lingering clouds, as if giving its blessing. Local reporters, some city council members, and dozens of curious onlookers gathered on the courthouse steps. Cameras lined up, microphones at the ready. Patricia stood at a small podium with Mikal at her side. Ava was there, guide dog by her feet, joined by several other individuals who had experienced discrimination. Chris, standing slightly off to the side, tried to keep the focus on them. But inevitably, the press recognized him. Whispers spread through the crowd. "That's Chris Hemsworth," they murmured. Camera lenses swung toward him. He didn't mind. If the media attention could amplify the voices of the people behind him, that was exactly why he was there. Patricia began by summarizing RAA's mission. "While we fight for accessibility and justice for people with disabilities in Redwood City, today, we bring to light evidence that Redwood City Transit has systematically failed to address repeated violations of disabled passengers' rights." She presented an overview of the testimonies, pausing to recognize each individual who bravely shared their story. Then came Chris's footage, projected on a portable screen for everyone to see. The scene of Aroy denying Ava, shutting the bus doors, and only relenting under public pressure, played out in stark clarity. The audience reacted with soft gasps, heads shaking in disapproval. Patricia ended the screening by reading Redwood City Transit's tepid email response. "This is not enough," she said. "Real change is overdue." Next, Ava, leaning toward the microphones, recounting the bus driver's words and the humiliation she felt. "I didn't want to be the face of a movement," she said. "I just wanted to get home that day with my guide dog. But now, I realize how many others have gone through this. I stand here for all of us." Chris then stepped forward. Flashes went off, and a flurry of camera clicks sounded. He lifted a hand, acknowledging the press. His voice carried through the sound system, calm but resolute. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a disability rights advocate by profession. I'm someone who happened to witness an injustice. And when I stepped forward, I discovered a bigger problem. Redwood City Transit's leadership has failed to uphold the rights of people like Ava, Marco, Danielle, and so many others. We're calling on them to adopt comprehensive policies, mandatory training, and a zero-tolerance approach to any discrimination. We're not here to tear down Redwood City Transit. We're here to fix it so every resident feels safe and respected." After the speeches, reporters fired questions in rapid succession. "Misser, why are you personally involved in this? Do you plan to sue Redwood City Transit? Is there any response from Redwood City Transit officials today?" Chris answered politely but directed most queries toward Patricia or the legal experts. His star power got them the headlines, but he wanted the narrative to remain on the people who truly suffered. By late afternoon, video clips from the press conference had spread across social media. Hashtags referencing Redwood City Transit and disability rights sprang up. Outrage bubbled in local forums, with many Redwood City residents expressing shock and disappointment that their community's bus system was ignoring basic accessibility laws. Others shared personal anecdotes of trouble with Redwood City Transit, fueling the momentum for change. That evening, Redwood City Transit's official account finally released a statement on social media. "We take these allegations seriously. We are launching a thorough investigation into staff conduct and will review our training protocols. We appreciate the community's patience during this process." But to the campaigners, it sounded more like a public relations deflection than a strong commitment to reform. The city's population was no longer convinced by vague assurances. They wanted to see concrete steps. Within days, Redwood City's mayor, Angela Stanton, called an emergency meeting with Redwood City Transit's leadership and key members of the city council. Under intense public pressure, they demanded a detailed plan for change, a timeline, budget allocations for training, and accountability measures. Redwood City Transit's director, Randolph King, found himself cornered in ways he never had been before. Sponsors threatened to pull funding if the controversy continued unabated. Ridership was already declining as some community members boycotted the buses in solidarity with disabled passengers. Faced with mounting evidence and public outcry, Redwood City Transit was forced to propose a wide-reaching reform package. It included mandatory sensitivity and disability rights training for every driver and staff member, immediate disciplinary measures for any proven violation of riders' rights, and an internal complaint system with an independent oversight committee. One that could no longer sweep issues under the rug. News of this proposal spread rapidly, greeted by cautious optimism from RA and the affected community members. They wanted to ensure it was not another empty promise. Over the course of several tense weeks, Redwood City Transit's board hashed out the specifics, hammered by city council members who realized they'd be held accountable by their constituents if the plan fell through. Throughout it all, Chris remained in Redwood City, checking in frequently with Patricia and Mikkel, attending roundtables, meeting with local leaders, and quietly lending his influence whenever the bureaucracy threatened to stall. It was an exhausting process, filled with legal wrangling, emotional testimonies, and negotiations that pushed everyone to their limits. Finally, on a clear, bright morning in late spring, Redwood City Transit held a public event to unveil its new inclusive policy framework. A crowd gathered outside the transit station. banners proclaiming, "Transit for Al," hung from the building's facade. Even the weather seemed to celebrate the occasion. Golden sunlight bathed the streets, and a soft breeze rustled the banners. Among the attendees were members of RA, local journalists, elected officials, and curious residents. People with disabilities were present in large numbers. Some with guide dogs, others in wheelchairs, still others with hearing aids or other assistive devices, forming a living testament to the community's diversity. On a small stage, Redwood City Transit's leadership presented the official policy changes. Randolph King, looking more humble than ever, acknowledged past mistakes. "We understand that we have not been meeting our obligations to the community, especially those with disabilities. Today, we commit to making Redwood City Transit an accessible, welcoming service for everyone." The entire board then pledged a budget for training, outlines for oversight committees, and a new complaint reporting system with timelines for resolution and serious disciplinary actions for offenders. Applause echoed from the crowd, though tempered by the memory of the struggles that brought them there. Patricia approached the podium next, flanked by Ava and Chris. "We stand here as a community," Patricia said, "one that believes in accountability, transparency, and compassion. This policy is a victory, but it's just the first step. We will remain vigilant to ensure it's followed in practice, not just on paper." Ava gripped the microphone, her guide dog calm and confident beside her. "I never thought one bus ride would lead to this. I'm grateful to everyone who spoke up, and to Chris, who was brave enough to film and share the truth. This isn't about forcing out one bad driver. It's about making sure no one else has to go through that humiliation. We all deserve access and respect. That's what true community means." Chris stood quietly, letting Ava's words resonate. When he finally spoke, his voice held a tinge of emotion. "I've played heroes on screen, but in real life, heroes are people like Ava and Patricia and everyone from RAA. They fight these battles every day, often without recognition or support. I'm honored to have played some part in this journey. Let's keep pushing forward together." A roar of applause followed. Some took pictures, capturing the moment Redwood City took a stand for reform. Journalists asked for interviews, focusing mainly on Ava and the RAA members, letting them be the voices of the movement. Chris, stepping away from the limelight, felt a sense of relief and pride. Change was tangible now. Redwood City had become a little more just, a little more inclusive. A testament to what could happen when ordinary people refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. In the weeks that followed, the new policies took root. Drivers attended workshops led by disability rights trainers, featuring direct interactions with people who used service dogs or wheelchairs, or who were visually or hearing impaired. Some drivers, including Elroy, resisted at first, grumbling about excessive sensitivity. But under the new zero-tolerance rules, they faced stern warnings, shape up, or risk disciplinary action. Others embraced the training, realizing they simply lacked understanding and were eager to improve. Redwood City's municipal government funded better signage, clearer guidelines at bus stops, and a user-friendly website explaining rider rights. Ava continued to ride the bus with Riley, noticing fewer stares and more polite offers of assistance. She also took on a volunteer role with RAA, helping educate new trainers on the experiences of visually impaired passengers. Marco, the veteran, reported the drivers now asked how best to accommodate his needs, rather than questioning the legitimacy of his service dog. Danielle's son boarded with ease, his wheelchair slot left clear for him. The changes weren't perfect. Some drivers and staff still lagged behind, but progress was undeniably there. For Chris, the experience had been transformative. He extended his stay in Redwood City long enough to see the reforms begin, then quietly prepared to leave, returning to his usual life of film commitments and philanthropy. But Redwood City would always hold a special place in his heart. He'd experienced firsthand the power of collective action. and the crucial difference that even one voice, or one camera, could make. On the day of his departure, he stopped by the RA office to say goodbye. Patricia hugged him warmly. "You did more than you'll ever know," she whispered. Mikhail gave him a firm handshake, eyes brimming with gratitude. Ava thanked him again, stroking Riley's ears. "We wouldn't have gotten here without your help," she said. Chris shook his head gently. "You all would have found a way." "I'm just glad I could lend a hand." Riley gave a soft bark, as though echoing the sentiment, and Chris laughed, giving the Labrador a friendly pat. Then, with a promise to keep in touch and visit whenever he was back in the area, he stepped outside into the bright Redwood City afternoon. He paused on the sidewalk, inhaling the scents of coffee and blooming trees. Across the street, a city bus pulled up to a stop. Through the large windows, he spotted a driver greeting a passenger with a guide dog, offering assistance in guiding them on board. It was a simple exchange, routine but full of meaning. The door closed, and the bus rumbled away, carrying that passenger smoothly on to their destination. No fear, no hassle, just a normal ride. Chris smiled, feeling a bittersweet rush of satisfaction. The battle was won, and Redwood City was better for it. Now it was time for him to go, but the city's story, and the stories of all those who needed those buses, would continue moving forward, powered by the collective determination of people who refused to accept anything less than justice. As Chris climbed into a taxi bound for the airport, he reflected on the journey, a random afternoon drizzle, a tense moment at a bus stop, and a single video clip had ignited a wave of reform. No scriptwriter could have planned it better. In real life, though, the end of one victory was just the beginning of another challenge. He hoped Redwood City would keep that fighting spirit alive, ready to stand up whenever an injustice surfaced, big or small. The knowledge that he had played a part in sparking that spirit felt more rewarding than any cinematic triumph ever could. A text message popped up on his phone, from Patricia. It read, "A new powerful story drops every evening starting tomorrow. Hit subscribe." Chris laughed softly at the playful line. Patricia was repurposing the advocacy group's sign-off slogan, reminding him that their fight for rights and equality was an ongoing story worth following. He saved the message, comforted by the knowledge that Redwood City and RAA would continue shining a light on injustices, one story at a time. And in that light, everyone could see the path to making things right. Subscribe now. Another inspiring story every evening starting tomorrow.